Now, for the 12th time, the pastor will come up and bring questions that have accumulated through the weeks.
That's such a beautiful statement that you read at the end and touches so deeply. But it seems to me to come back to the topic or the title for your presentation this evening. In the very title itself, you have acknowledged that there are many who have seen God's law as a threat to our freedom. And many sincere individuals, Christians who have felt that somehow God's law was something from which we wanted to be free. For example, I've heard this text mentioned so often, Romans 10:4. Christ is the end of the law. Now, doesn't that mean real freedom from the law? Wouldn't that be the answer to the problem of the law being a hindrance to our freedom? Christ is the end of the law.
Don't have to love and behave anymore. We can be disorderly and live in chaos.
Well, now wait. What does that text mean?
Yeah, that's the thing. The text needs to be analyzed first for the words and then for the context. First of all, the word end. Now, a rare meaning is the purpose of the law, but I doubt that's the meaning in the context. I think it means termination, all right. Law does not have an article in front of it, meaning any particular law, although whether the article is there or not is not totally convincing in a context. You've got to read the whole setting. Mm-hmm. In the setting, Paul, all the way through the book of Romans, is contrasting the obedience that springs from love and trust and the obedience that springs from law. And the obedience that springs from law is often the obedience that comes from fear. And that even turns us into rebels as we obey. So he comes to 10:4. It's interesting, 10:4, doesn't that mean the end of something in journalism? 10:4. Christ is the 10:4. Christ is the termination of law as a way of being saved. That's the meaning.
All right.
It's the end of legalism is what that means. Phillips has a marvelous rendering of that. Christ means the end of the struggle for righteousness by works of law, that everyone who has faith in God may be saved. That's beautifully done.
But along with a text like Romans 10:4, I think of the one in Romans 6, which I can hear someone asking, it says we're not under the law but under grace. Mm-hmm. Now, isn't that another statement of real freedom, to not be under the law but under grace?
And again, what's the meaning of being under the law? And we often explain that as meaning we're not under the condemnation of the law. I think, again, it's this contrast with Paul, that in our relationship with God, we're not under law, we're under grace. We do not deal with a legalistic God, we deal with a God who is graciousness personified. And he says, if you realize you're dealing with a gracious God, then that helps to get rid of sin. He said, when you're dealing with God in a legalistic manner, it even provokes to sin. And you remember in Romans 7, Paul describes this. He says, there was a day when I looked at the law and it provoked me to sin, especially number 10 irritated me, until I realized God's gracious purpose in giving it to us. Now he says, I delight in the law. So one really cannot understand law until one understands God's gracious purpose, which means one has to know what he's like. And that's his message. We do not deal with a God of legalism, but a God of graciousness. Makes all the difference in the world. That makes sin even more serious.
And then what you're saying is that in that setting, the law has a proper place.
Very much so.
One of God's emergency
measures. Very
wisely
chosen emergency measures, yes.
You've spoken about various of the Ten Commandments, but as I think about the seventh-day Sabbath, and remember Paul's statement in Romans 14:5 that the Sabbath, speaking in this context of the Sabbath, he says, let everyone be persuaded in his own mind. Now, isn't that just leaving it up for personal choice? What issue should we really make of this? Isn't it just a matter of how you feel about it or your personal opinion, as far as at least the Sabbath is concerned, the fourth commandment is concerned?
Now, if we take it that way, that would suggest that when it comes to deciding which God you're going to follow, you're not free to make up your own mind or any of the others. It's only with respect to the Sabbath. It seems to me that if we have not made up our own minds freely about God, then our worship is worthless. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind is the way God approaches us on everything he asks us to do. It isn't just with respect to the Sabbath. So that doesn't suggest the Sabbath is less important because we're free to make up our own minds. It just says, with respect to love, trust, obedience, you name it, we're free to make up our own minds.
He isn't saying it doesn't matter what you think.
No.
He's saying you have freedom
That's
to
right.
choose.
And that's why he says, and therefore don't go around condemning other people. God does not condemn them. Everyone is free to make up his own mind.
But he isn't saying all roads lead to the same place, then.
No, not at all.
That it doesn't matter what choice you make.
The choice is very important, but it still must be yours.
It's not forced upon.
Now, before that, he wouldn't say, one man esteems one day above another, another man esteems all days alike, let everyone be persuaded in his own mind. Before he knew God as gracious on the Damascus Road, he would say, I know some of you are wrong on this, and I'm on my way to put you into prison, and I'll have you stoned for doing it. Not anymore. Now he'd learned that we're not under law, we're under grace.
In your presentation this evening, it seems clear that you're convinced that we need to be attentive to all 10 of the commandments. But isn't a person, you've mentioned the word legalist here, isn't a person who is concerned about the law, who is even thinking about the 10 commandments, isn't such a person a legalist? Isn't that the meaning of legalism? A person who thinks about the law. Shouldn't we be thinking about Jesus rather than about the law?
Well, it's interesting when you think of the fact that to obey the law is to love. This suggests that the loving person is the legalist. And then it doesn't seem to make sense. But I think on a broader basis, one needs to consider the real meaning of legalism. Currently, my best understanding of the meaning of legalism is this. I believe that the essence of legalism is preoccupation with our legal standing with a legalistic God. And so many Christians are preoccupied with their legal standing because they don't really know God. They don't realize that he is a gracious God who is not preoccupied with our legal standing. But like the father of the prodigal son, he's very preoccupied with our welfare and whether or not we'll come home. That's what God is preoccupied with. So unfortunately, the word legalism is often misused. So I repeat it, the essence of legalism is preoccupation with one's legal standing with God.
Well, now, Graham, then you're saying that a person might not be just concerned about the 10 commandments. Let me ask you this. Could a person believe and accept, for instance, Christ's sacrifice in his or her place in such a way, could he or she think about that in such a way that they would, in effect, be a legalist?
Yeah, this is something to say very carefully. But I really believe that's true. If you believe Jesus died primarily to adjust our legal standing with a God who's preoccupied with our legal standing, you are a legalist. And this means that you no longer take to God the blood of bulls and goats to adjust your legal standing. And I want to say this very reverently. We now take him, the blood of his Son, and say, will this adjust my legal standing? He said, that's good. Now you've brought me the right blood. This is legalism.
So you're saying that the focus of our idea of salvation or our experience of salvation on some kind of meeting a legal requirement or satisfying some legal requirement becomes a matter of legalism.
That's the devil's sad perversion. He's actually taken the death of Christ, which is a monument to freedom, and suggests that God is not preoccupied with our legal standing. He's turned that into just another ceremony to adjust legal standing. In other words, those who misunderstood the ceremonies in Old Testament times, but then became Christians, applied the same misunderstanding to the cross and to the blood of Christ. It's just that now they had better blood and more persuasiveness with the Father to adjust their legal standing. It sounds terrible to say that.
With that, it seems to me you've opened the idea of the meaning and the problem of legalism to a much broader perspective, a very important perspective. You've given us something to think about.
And it supports the devil's charge. You see that God is arbitrary, exacting, vengeful, unforgiving, and severe. See, all legalism is based on the conception that God has to execute those who disobey him. Therefore, forgiveness will take care of it. That's what produces legalism.
Well, now, I want to come back to a basic question that I've heard again and again, and I'm sure will be in the minds of many of our hearers. How do you answer the question then, must one obey God's law to be saved? You've said the law is not a threat to our freedom, but on the other hand, Don't I have to obey it in order to be
Well,
saved?
maybe the safest way to approach that in a brief time is to consider the word obedience. The biblical word means to hearken, to listen. The Greek word is to listen humbly. As Micah said, all God asks of us is that we walk humbly before our God. The thief on the cross didn't have much time to live up to all the precepts of the many, many laws that have been used as God's emergency measures. But he certainly was humbly and gratefully and reverently willing to listen to the one in the middle. And he died willing to listen, sincerely, honestly willing to listen. He will arise in the same frame of mind. And he has much to learn, but he'll be a good pupil, a good disciple. Like last week in church, he'll be a good disciple. That means he's willing to listen, to accept instruction, to accept correction.
Would you feel better then, Graham, if I didn't say you have to obey God's law to be saved, you have to listen to be saved?
Well, to go beyond that even, to obey God's law is to be loving.
Well, do I have to be loving to
Well,
be saved?
Jesus said to Nicodemus, unless you be born of the Spirit, you'll not be saved. And the man who's born of the Spirit, whose fruit is love and truth, will now have truth in the inner man. He'll have a new heart and a right spirit. Yes, I would say unless one has the essence of the beginning of this experience of love and trustworthiness, he will not be saved. And that's 1 John. Hereby we know we've passed from death unto life because we love the brethren. I mean, unless we see the beginning of new regard for each other, we do not have the first symptom of salvation.
Are you saying, in effect, that there's something wrong with the way I'm trying to press this question on you? You know, do I have to do this? I'm trying to find out, is there something I have to do to be saved? Is that the way I am saved? Am I saved because I do such and such?
I'd love to jump to that to one of our latest meetings is on the matter of perfection. Do I have to be perfect? I would say in all these things, these are not things God demands of us, he offers to us. He says, I offer you a new heart, I offer you a right spirit, I offer you healing. Do you want it? If I don't want it, I'm not savable. In fact, the word save means to heal. If I say I don't want to be healed, but to be healed is to have a loving heart and truth in the inner man. Yes.
But let me try it another way, though.
But to put the Ten Commandments on the wall, the way one might do in a mechanical sort of a way, is to miss the whole point anyway.
But our subject tonight has to do with a threat to our freedom.
That's right.
Now, out of what you've said, let me ask this, I trust respectfully. Am I really free if I have to love and obey? Isn't that what you're saying?
Yes.
I need to listen and love and obey, then am I really free? I've got to do this.
Well, let's put it this way. If we live in a society where we don't love each other and we can't be trusted, there'll be no freedom.
Ah, good point.
There can't be freedom without it. There can't be freedom in a disorderly, chaotic society. In a lawless place, there can't be. So these are interesting questions. You see, isn't it interesting how you can phrase it in just such a way that it sounds like a burden, sounds like a restriction on our freedom, and then you stop to think, what's he asking us to do anyway? Just to love each other, to be trustworthy, to be safe, to be free? Who'd want to turn that down? You say, do I have to be free? Do I have to be safe? Do I have to be healthy? Do I have to be well? He says, no. And I can't command
I'm free to
it,
choose.
but I offer it to you. And some of us say, I like that very much.
When Jesus says, and you had this text in our Bible reference sheet here, Matthew 11, come to me and all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. But when you talk about listening and obedience, he says, my yoke is easy. Is this really easy? Is it light?
And light. In comparison with the many, many rules and regulations they had, which made no sense, it was very light. And yet Jesus says that you have omitted the weightier matters in the law. So in a sense, it's heavy. What is? Love is weighty and heavy in the sense of importance. It's very important. I think what makes God's commandments light is that they make such good sense, that they call for our intelligent obedience. And when I obey something intelligently, I want to do it. It makes sense. It's dumb not to. Then the burden is gone. I think it's in that sense because it actually calls for complete commitment, isn't it?
And if we end up describing or trying to describe the kind of world that we'd like to live in, where things would be wonderful and different from the kind of trauma we find in this world, we end up describing the world that God has invited us to live in.
Exactly.
What is the truth? You concluded by talking about the truth that sets us free. Just remind us again, what is the truth?
Yeah, unfortunately, in the legal model, the truth is we've been forgiven and won't have to go to hell. I think the truth that sets us free is the truth about God, the kind of person that he is.
Does forgiving a person set that person free, just forgiving them?
Forgiveness doesn't change the heart necessarily. And remember last time I mentioned that heaven will not be peopled with forgiven crooks. I mean, if heaven
We're
is...
still crooks.
We're still crooks. Unless the heart is changed, there'll be no real freedom. Well, this brings up again the difference between the legal model and the real healing, health, trust model. And last time in the after service, I used a brief illustration that I found helpful.
Yes.
I mean, supposing you had to keep rat poison. We're having a lot of trouble with rats right now. Well, I've got some. Suppose you had to keep rat poison in your house, and you have a young son. And if he touches it, eats it, he could be very sick, even die. So you say, son, don't touch that rat poison. I'm going to put it on the highest shelf behind a locked cupboard. A little later, you hear a crash in the garage. And you run out, and there's your son lying on the floor. He's taken the rat poison, and he's dying. Would it do any good to say, son, I forgive you, I forgive you? He'd just die forgiven, that's all. It wouldn't keep him from dying. Nor would it do any good to say, son, I don't want you to die, so let me drink the rat poison. Now you both die. The boy doesn't need forgiveness, he needs an antidote. He needs healing. But God didn't wait for that. God has said, you don't really take me seriously, do you? That sin is like a poison and will lead to your death. Let me take the poison. And Jesus died. And we, like the son, say, Dad, it's real, isn't it? I mean, nobody's killing you. Sin is really a poison, and you are dying. I will take you seriously from here on. The beauty is that God then was able to take his life back and go on living. I've made my point. There's no legal requirement in that. There's an awesome truth to be revealed. There's nothing arbitrary in this thing. God does not want us to poison ourselves. And forgiveness doesn't keep us from the results of being poisoned. We need healing. Better heed the warning. The results of sin is death, and don't do this thing. That's the other model. That's the healing model, not the legalistic model.
Now, we've tried to deal with some of the questions that have come up in a general way. I'd like to move to several specific questions that have come up from our congregation. Here's one. Growing up as an Adventist, I always thought the Sabbath would be one of the big issues at the end of time. If the Sabbath is something we should is the Sabbath something we should hold on to as a belief, strong enough to die for, if it is a temporary emergency measure just for the present? That's a very good question.
That's a very good question. Certainly the great controversy is not over a day. It's over a commitment. It's over a great truth. And it's the meaning of the Sabbath that speaks to that truth that makes it an important issue. That those who meaningfully observe the Sabbath in the last days will be publicly declaring they worship Christ as their God, that the Father is just as gracious as the Son, and all the other things we talked about 2 times ago. Apart from the meaning of the Sabbath, then there's not a very good answer to that question. But in the light of its meaning, yes, indeed, the Sabbath could be a central issue of enormous consequence. And because of its meaning, it could be continued through eternity. Because think of all there'll be to remember in the hereafter. A monument to freedom.
We've had this kind of question come in many times, and I'd like to take this specific one as a sample of many who've asked this kind of question. If God's purpose is to restore to love relationship with his children, how could asking them to kill an animal, this has to do with the emergency measures that you spoke about in the Old Testament times, how could God asking them to kill an animal do this? In my opinion, this would only tend to make people cruel and harden their hearts rather than create a loving, sympathetic spirit. It would seem to me it would reflect the cruel spirit of Satan rather than the loving, gracious God. What about
unfortunately, it has had that effect because many people offered the sacrifice in hopes that God would love the smell and forgive them and bless them, and it became a rather satanic thing. God must have hated this emergency measure, and yet it had to be that dramatic. Well, as for Adam, for example, when he killed the first lamb to be convinced that sin is serious, it does lead to death. I wonder how hard he hit that lamb, and what did he hit it with? Not hard enough to kill it, just hurt it. And he hit it harder. Then blood appeared. He'd never seen that before, And Adam turns to God and says, God, I'm not sure I can go on with this. It's making me sick. And God says, may it always make you sick, every time. But they became so accustomed to it, they could do it almost as a circus, Josephus says, cutting the animals up and brandishing them as they placed them on the altar to be burned. They'd forgotten the meaning. That's the thing. So God chose something, like many of his emergency measures, rather awesome, sometimes rather horrible, in order to sufficiently impress his people.
I can hear our questioner saying, well, but with all of these risks, why would God go ahead, recognizing that this could happen? Wasn't there a better way?
Like some people wish the whole Bible could have been written differently and made a little clearer. I would say the all-wise one used the very best way he knew how, and some have not misunderstood. Some have said, if you're the one who sees the little sparrow fall and you asked us to kill these animals, it must have been, in your wisdom, necessary to impress us sufficiently. And to have, of course, the particular meaning that an innocent one was going to come and die this death later on.
Related to last week and the emergency measures, a questioner writes, I was disappointed that you used Galatians 3:19, 24 and 25, referring to the Ten Commandments, whereas Paul is concerned about the doctrine of circumcision, and the entire book was to endeavor to change their view of the ceremonial law, see Acts 15 and so on. Isn't it true that the sacrificial system is the added law? Doesn't Colossians 2:14 to 16 talk about a law that was to be blotted out?
One could readily come to that conclusion, but I think one would pay a price for taking that view and not including all law. What has happened is we think of a legalist as a person who still follows the ceremonial law, and we say there's no way you could be legalistic about the Ten Commandments. And yet the most damaging legalism has been with respect to the 10, and maybe the most damaging has been with respect to the fourth of the 10 commandments. So I believe Paul's point is about all law. All law was an emergency measure to bring us back to faith and a right relationship.
All right.
I think that's the point. And so if you leave out the 10, you're suggesting there's no way you can be legalistic about the 10.
Let's see if we can cover these two in these last 2 minutes here. If the universe was satisfied when Christ died, then why are we still here?
That's a great question. We have one coming up soon. What is God waiting for is something I think we ought to carry in mind right through our remaining conversations. What is he waiting for? Why did he wait so long to send his son? Why is he waiting so long to send him back the second time?
Here's an intriguing one. Would we lose our freedom if God always rewarded the righteous? If righteousness always pays off, why...
That might explain why he doesn't sometimes, as with Job in Scripture. It's true, if every time I did what was right, God would reward me. See what that would do in the way of motivation. Then I do what I do because God has told me to, and he has the power to reward and destroy. I think that would produce obedience number one. And so people like Job were not rewarded right away, and he loved God anyway. Though God slay me, yet will I trust him, that friend of God was able to say.
You made some mention here, in that number 3 about why we obey. He commands me to do something beyond my present understanding. Yes. My trust is such. And that may be true even when it appears that righteousness is not rewarded.
Right.
What is the difference between killing and murdering? Is it because the damage is yourself by just hating your brother? And another person says, I'm confused. Thou shalt not kill is a commandment, and yet God told his people to kill. Can you touch on that very quickly?
Yeah, the Hebrew and the Greek words both mean murder. Thou shalt not murder. Many modern versions so translate it. And what's so bad about murdering is, as was mentioned there, what happens inside. And Jesus said, he who hates his brother has done the damage. He is a murderer. And God has never said, go and murder people. Now, he did instruct them to go and kill in battle, but he didn't want them to. It's very clear. He said, let mine angel do it. Let me put my children to sleep. He never wanted them to kill at all. That, too, was an emergency measure. But at the end of the millennium, God doesn't violate that law. Do you think he hates his children as they die? He doesn't even kill them. He watches them die and he cries. God has never violated his 10 commandments. Never.
Let's take just a moment, Graham, to talk about next Friday evening's number 13 in our series. How God treats his erring children.
Yeah, to me, that's the most convincing evidence that God is not arbitrary, exacting, vengeful, and severe. in demonstration, not in words.
Is this what happens when we sin and how God
How he treats us.
That'll be an important one.
Not that his kindness would make us careless about sinning. It makes you feel a much worse crook and much less grateful when you do sin.
Next Friday night.